This particular video is directed towards my fellow Gen Xers, those in the generation, the demographic that I come from, where we're born roughly between 1965 and around up until around 1984. If you were born anywhere in that time frame, then you are considered a Gen Xer. And I'm pretty sure if you are a Gen Xer and you pay any attention to the news or media, the propagandists, right, the opinion makers, or politicians, I mean, just think about it. Whether it's the bigwigs in the corporations, when they're propagating their messages, or, people, the central planners and people in government, or the media pundits, the political propagandists, I'm sure most of you probably recognize at this point that the only two demographics that you even hear about are the baby boomers, which would be my parents' generation, those born between 1946 and 1964, and the millennials, my children's generation, or actually, I should say, people like myself from Gen X that started our families early. We actually have children that are roughly in about the same age as the people in my parents' generation that waited till they were in their 30s and 40s to have their families. So there are some boomers that have millennial children, which is, yeah, I mean, hey, whatever. But you know that the millennials, so what would they be from like 85 to 2004 or whatever that demographic lines up to be. Usually it's about a 20-year time frame for the difference between demographics, generations. Now the Gen Z, the very youngest of the generations alive today, they're not discussed because they're not productive members in society as of yet. So, but if you think about it, I mean, think about the psychological aspect, the big picture aspect of why Gen Xers are completely ignored by the political and propagandists. I mean, if you think about it, if you look around, if you pay attention to anyone, or the majority of people in media, the decision makers, those in positions of power and influence, predominantly come from the baby boomer generation. They are the ones that are pulling the strings for the most part. So the fact that they seemingly wish to ignore their immediate offspring, their children, those from Generation X, and instead talk about the millennials. Well, I mean, that should tell you who these people are and where they come from, right? Either they're these government cronies, or, obviously feminists, or these people that chose to make careers, money as their priority rather than family. So, I mean, that automatically, you can delve into the psychological aspect of it and start to understand what the reasoning behind it is. But the fact of the matter remains, and I see it with the people, I've hung around with, and I've had friends, associates, other family members, and I'm very much in the know, and I recognize, and I realize, and I've known this for a long time, before any of the propaganda started recognizing and talking about this, is, yeah, my generation, I think we're the last generation that remembers and understands what true freedom is all about. We were the ones that, for the most part, while our boomer generational parents were off worrying about their careers and making the money and all that, which hey, I'm fine. But while that was happening, and they were taught to be so worried about themselves and themselves only, which, hey, nothing wrong with that. But what the direct result, the direct consequence of that are my generation being raised as latchkey kids, more or less. Whereas even in our pre-teens, we were left home alone constantly, all of us, for the most part. You ask anyone from my generation, And yeah, other than having to be home, at dark maybe. But if your mom or whatever had a boyfriend over, well, that even then it's like, just make sure to stay alive, I guess, right? I mean, we were basically placed on the back burner so that our parents could enjoy the fruits of all the central planning and all the theft that their political classes among them were, and the central banking and the amount of debts that people were allowed to incur. They were enjoying all of those benefits, and to them, family for the most part. I mean, yes, they cared for their children, but it was a different kind of relationship during those eras, which I'm kind of appreciative, because it taught me to be a strong person. Left to my own devices for the most part, it taught me to be self-reliant and strong. And because I did have the ability to think for myself, I had no choice, because I wasn't having really a whole lot of feedback from my parents. They were busy doing their thing. So I had to use my own mind. So that part of it, I'm very grateful for. That part, but if you think about it, at this stage now, it was okay back when we were kids, but at this stage now, our boomer parents, they look at us as we are their immediate and direct competition now. We are the ones that they know will truly challenge them. We are the ones that they know will really hold their feet to the fire. The millennials, their grandkids, yes, just like with a grandparent with their grandkids, it's a totally different relationship, because you don't have to raise them. You do, as a grandparent, you don't have to be constantly, in the child's life. You just can come in it whenever you want, give them treats, and then leave them to their parents to deal with all the other bullshit. And it's the same whether in the family unit or in societies in general. This is just looking at things in the big picture. And yes, it's generalized. So of course, there are exceptions to the rule. But in reality, that's what we're really talking about, is the baby boomers. They recognize that for the most part, that, we're not going to be able to rely on those kids that we ignored and dictated and dominated and tried to control and manipulate, use mysticism and force against them. I guess that relationship probably turned pretty sour, especially when they became older. Like, look at myself. I'm in my mid-40s. And my parents' generation have done nothing. I mean, when I was younger, like I said, those aspects of throwing me to the wolves kind of thing, and forced me to learn. I actually appreciate that, because it made me build my character, made me be the strong individual person I am today. That I'm appreciative for. But I'm not a child no more, and my parents and those from their demographics, they recognize. And I shouldn't say this specific to my parents, because in reality, my real dad, he passed long ago when I was 17 years old. My stepdad, I wouldn't even include in that equation. I'm sure, he's just a blue collar and working kind of guy. And my mother, she was raised in a family that had its own issues, many of them. So I realized that, I don't want to place the blame solely on my parents, but they are just regurgitating, repeating what was hammered into their head by their counterparts from that demographic, the evil, the vile, the sadistic, the sociopaths, and they fell for the snake oil salesman of their own demographic. So they now are aligned, and they're so reliant on that system that they allowed to flourish because they benefit from it. The system of governments that has grown dramatically. I mean, my parents' generation grew government. I mean, you can't imagine from the time when even myself in my 45 years, the way I remember things as a child to the way things are now. Yeah, my parents allowed governments to grow massively because they benefited from it. And they still benefit from it. And they recognize that their benefits are soon going to come to an end. And they recognize if that's going to happen, predominantly the people that are going to take that power away from them are their children. So they're now trying desperately to use the system, whether it's through education or propaganda or media or so all these aspects that they can use it, all the tools at their disposal. They are now realizing, okay, yeah, we fucked up with our own kids. They're not going to do whatever we want because, damn it, we created them. They're so independent, they don't even listen to us anymore. So now they're trying to use their grandkids, the millennial generation, to turn them into the next political classes. But they want to make sure that it works out to their benefit. And for the most part, these millennials seem to be willing to go along to get along. Well, some of them. But I think once they get older, that's the thing. Even the oldest of the millennials now are just barely, starting to understand what it is to be, a modern wage slave in this country. People like myself, we know what it's all about because we've been functioning in this environment for a long time now. But the millennials, the younger generation, they will come to terms. They will come to realize, especially in the age of information that we live in today, which is why the propagandists, the opinion makers, the mysticists, they're trying their best. I mean, that's why they're trying to propagate. That's why they're totally skipping over their children's generation to their grandkids. They want to mold their minds. But I think it's going to fail in the long run because the millennials they still are going to have to function in the same environment. Even with their grandparents giving them all the treats. Well, when your grandparents no longer have that ability to keep throwing treats at you, and you have to function in the real world, then you're going to be on the same level. And you might actually start to grasp the understanding, the reasoning of why Gen Xers, people such as myself, people from my demographic, we want nothing to do with the political process. We want nothing to do, which is why, and the way I raise my family, because I don't want nothing to do with centrally planning my kids' lives. I learned the errors of those ways. I seen how violent, sadistic, and how the negative consequences and ramifications are so severe for doing so. So yeah, most of us now in my demographic are, you might as well say, apolitical. Basically, all we want to do is get along, enjoy our life, enjoy our family, put food on the table, a roof on the head, over their heads. But our parents' generation and the grandkids, our kids, are seeming now, hopefully they won't both come together to mess us up, because which I don't believe will ever happen actually, because we're the only ones. I'm sure they at least recognize that your grandparents might be able to throw you more money because they have that capacity, but it's your parents that are showing you the proper methods and ways to cohabitate, to exist. They're showing you what love and compassionate and leading by example. That's what I try to do. I'm trying to lead by example. No matter how difficult it may be, I will never use force, coercion. I don't want to dictate your lives. I want to show you how to do things properly. I want you to recognize that that's the way things need to be done for humanity to evolve past all this pain, suffering, and anguish. Sleep well, baby boomers. The millennials aren't taking over politics yet. Now, this is an article out of the Washington Post by Philip Bump, but it's being reshared by the National Post, National Post is covering this particular article as well. Alert, alert. The Wall Street Journal blared on its front page on Tuesday. Alert, alert. The Wall Street Journal blared on its front page on Tuesday. Millennials unsettle race. The aforementioned race being that for the presidency. And the unsettling referring to the disruption that's been unsettling baby boomers the country over. The decrease in demographic dominance of America's once largest generation. For the first time, reporter Janet Hook writes in her lead, millennials will match baby boomers as a share of the electorate. I'm so glad we're not in there. I take such great pride and have such admiration and respect for my fellow Gen Xers that even though we're stolen and plundered and dictated, incarcerated, penalized, we still choose not to propagate that onto our generations. Proud of you. Proud of you, Gen Xers. That's the way you do it. Not that you should have to stand there and be whipped by either your kids or your parents, but the fact that you're not willing to grab that whip out of their hands and beat them back, you are leading by example. Your strength and courage is being recognized, believe me. Oh my God, boomers think as they try to catch their breath. What is this country coming to? Will they elect a selfie stick? I mean, think about even the derogatory manner in which they talk about the millennials, the younger generation. Like I said, at some point in time, these millennials are going to come to terms with just how vile these propagandists are. I mean, that they'll do anything to try to get you on board to their scheme, to be good little serfs and slaves. We will remind you that the term millennial doesn't have a hard and fast meaning. The Census Bureau recognizes only the boomers as a definable generation at this point, though it's not immune to the allure of using millennial to grab people's attention. Millennial essentially means younger people in a non-marketing context, and just how young these people are can vary widely. Pew Research figures that millennials are aged 19 to 35. That's sort of golf that makes lumping them together a little silly. There are millennials who have millennial babies, which sort of breaks the idea of it being a generation. Of course, there are also boomers who have boomer children, but let's not let that distract us. It's not clear how Hook is defining millennial, but she writes that the percentage of all eligible voters from that group is 31%, same as the boomers. Ergo, they match baby boomers as a share of the electorate. The grim fact underlying this shift, as millennials age, boomers are dying. Sorry, boomers. Well, we all know that anyways. Of course, yes. And the boomers, even before they die, when they become on the other side of the bell curve, and they're now the collectors of wealth from the central planners, not the providers of the wealth. Yeah, it's not going to be good. But it is important to note that share of those eligible to vote is not equal to share of the electorate. Older voters still turn out to vote much more heavily than younger voters. Good for them. Good for them. More positive signs and encouragement for me. So while the destiny of the millennial vote, using Pew's subjective delineations, in the overall voting population has increased, boomers are still a large portion of those who actually vote. Let's look at who turned out in Iowa and New Hampshire this year versus in 2008, the last time both parties had contested nominations. The age distribution between the two is likely the same. In 2008, people under 40 were 18% of the Democratic vote in New Hampshire and 14% of the Republican vote. This year, 19 and 15. In Iowa, the Republican turnout of those under 40 was 12% in 2008 and 2016, but turnout among those under 40 dropped from 23 to 18% among Iowa Democrats. In 2008, young people turned out in Iowa to vote for Barack Obama. In 2016, they were about as much of the electorate as the same age group was in New Hampshire. But that's age ranges, not millennials, which we hasten to repeat is a meaningless term. In 2008, millennials were all of the 18 to 24 age range and a slice of the 25 to 29-year-olds per Pew's definition. This year, they've seeped into the 30 to 39-year-old range. But boomers and older were still more than 50% in the vote in New Hampshire and Iowa among both parties. In New Hampshire, 51% of Democrats and 57% of Republicans were 50 and over. In Iowa, 58% Dems and 63% of Republicans were. This is why Hillary Clinton eked out a win in Iowa. Young people strongly preferred Bernie Sanders, but they didn't come out as heavily. Older voters preferred Clinton, and they did. There's not much reason to suspect that this trend will change for the general election. Older people who who move less frequently and tend to work more stable hours vote more heavily and will for some time. The argument that Sanders will drag young voters to the polls hasn't really helped so far this year, though the sample size is small. Taking a point of privilege here, I will note that there are always groups of enthusiastic young people who assume the world that people who assure the world that this time will be different and that the young people will change the world by turning out to vote, and then they don't. In 1992, a fifth of the electorate was under 30, down from 8 years prior. As a function of all voters, people under 30 vote less than they did 30 years ago. When the boomers were of that age group, it's on the increase in part because of the size of the post-1980 population boom. A lot of people were born in the 1990s. If the broader worry is that older voters won't get to anoint their favorite candidate, that Rubicon has been crossed. As I noted 2 years ago, the 2012 election was the first since 1976 that the oldest boomer age group voted for a candidate who didn't win the election. That year, 45 to 65-year-olds backed Mitt Romney, not Obama. A consolation for the boomers. The youngest age group voting this year was born in 1998, after the end of the millennials per pew. By 2020, those post-millennials, a group that still has no name despite MTV's marketing effort, will be creeping up on the millennials. Alert, alert, the world keeps on spinning. So, exactly. So once again, no such thing as Gen X. But if you do a Google search, you'll see that Gen X is a defined generation. As it should be, right? But completely ignored in this entire article. I actually hope that it continues to stay the way that the millennials, hopefully us Gen Xers, the millennials, and Gen Z, that's another thing, they're called Gen Z, the generation under the millennials, which are also AKA Gen Y, they'd be Gen Zers, okay? But hopefully Gen X, Y, and Z will all come together and use voluntarism, peaceful interactions and cohabitation and coexistence, free market fundamentals, without central force, without mysticism, without central planning governments and banks dictating and controlling our lives. Hopefully we can all come together and create and truly create a new way of dealing with each other, a new social and economic paradigm. And the old boomers, hopefully they can sit back in their latter years, in their dying days, and watch and say, damn, why couldn't we have done that? Look at them. They have managed to do something that no generations in history have accomplished. Yeah, that's what I hope to happen. I have great expectations and hope for all of our future. I know there's some pretty shady concepts and prospects in the immediate future. I know that. But I'm talking about the big picture, the long run, the end game. Humanity takes one step back, but with people like myself and all the other liberty lovers and those that stand for truth and freedom, we will advance humanity 2 steps forward. We will bring about the proper evolution of the human species. Peacefully, intellectually, in a voluntary and cooperative manner. Skinny Libertarian, and I love liberty.